Welcome to Tardisian Files.
Hello, listeners! We are beginning a new series of the podcast. And given whose face the Doctor is now wearing after the events of the reality war, I think it is only fitting that we review one of my favourite Billie Piper episodes from Revival Who. It's The End of the World. To be honest, I'm kind of surprised that I haven't reviewed this episode before now, as anyone who's listened to my list of episodes to best introduce new audiences to each incarnation of the Doctor, you'll know that this episode was actually my undisputed recommendation for the Ninth Doctor, and for Rose especially. Therefore, without further ado, I'm going to get into what happens in this episode and why it's personally one of my favourite Revival Who stories. Let's get into it. As with all of our reviews, we will be starting off with a recap of the episode's plot, so for those who haven't watched this episode, be warned, there will be spoilers ahead. So, in this episode, we see the Ninth Doctor take Rose to the year 5 billion, to witness the end of Earth from Platform 1, a luxurious space station orbiting the dying planet. Among the alien guests are the Face of Bo and Lady Cassandra Delta 17, a stretched out remnant of humanity obsessed with her appearances. But the party turns deadly when sabotaging robo-spiders, smuggled in by the adherents of the repeated meme, starts disabling the station's systems. The Doctor uncovers that the real villain is Cassandra, who orchestrated the chaos to profit from the others' deaths. As the station begins to fail, the Doctor and the tree being Jade race to restore the shields, with Jade sacrificing herself to save everyone. Cassandra tries to escape, but the Doctor brings her back, where the intense heat and lack of moisture cause her to quite literally fall apart. In the aftermath, the Doctor opens up to Rose about the loss of his people in a great war, revealing that he, like Cassandra, may well be the last of his kind. Summaries really cannot do this episode justice because it really was a labour of love, emphasis on labour, for the whole cast and production team involved. So, starting off with this episode's production, The End of the World was originally conceived as a visually spectacular and expensive episode to showcase what the new Doctor Who could do, with Platform 1 being inspired partly by the restaurant at the end of the universe. It also marks the first big emotional reveal of the series. The Doctor is the last of the Time Lords. This episode introduced key concepts like the psychic paper, the Time War, and, most importantly for this series, the phrase Bad Wolf. It also featured the show's first cold open, showing a few scenes of the episode before the title screen. This was a deviation from Classic Who, which would jump straight in with the titles before the episode began, and so this new format would actually become standard for the show moving forwards, which we can still see today in Doctor Who's, I think, third iteration, now that we're in New Who again. Lady Cassandra, who was voiced by Zoe Wanamaker, was designed as a satire of extreme beauty standards, inspired by red carpet appearances and the pressure on women at the time to be ultra thin. She was fully CGI and very expensive to animate, requiring stand-ins on set due to Wanamaker's absence. Additionally, Wanamaker's character was originally meant to have other items from human history, such as the Magna Carta and a copy of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, no doubt a reference to Wanamaker's role as Madame Hooch in the film adaptation of the book. And like most of New Who, filming actually took place mostly in Cardiff, with some of the shots being completed much earlier in the year to accommodate the actors' schedules. Namely the schedules of Zoe Wanamaker and Camille Coduri, whose commitments to other projects meant that their scenes and lines were some of the first ones to be shot. Visual effects were also massive for the time, 203 shots in total, making it one of the most effects-heavy episodes in the show's history. The robot spiders and Cassandra were completely digital, barring the one scene where we see Jabe scanning the creature, while alien costumes like the Moxa Balhoun were built practically. Fun fact actually, Britney Spears' Toxic wasn't actually available on vinyl, so for the scene where it's playing on the jukebox, the props team actually had to create a fake 7-inch single just for that episode. And ironically, the scene where we saw the Doctor and Rose in the street on Modern Day was one of the last scenes to be shot ever for the entire series. Not only was this scene incredibly moving and powerful for both the Doctor and Rose's character developments, but I personally think that there was a level of genuine emotion for both Christopher Eccleston and Billie Piper. I was unable to find any sources to corroborate if the pair of them actually were aware that this would be their last scene together, as the final filming block took place in February of 2005, and Eccleston's departure was announced later in March of the same year. So if both Eccleston and Piper knew that this would be their final scene, then it actually holds even more weight than it does for the Doctor and Rose, but for Eccleston and Piper as well, because you can see them convey the mix of emotions, having come to the end of a turbulent period, stepping back and clearing one's head, but eventually taking joy in the simple things such as a bowl of fresh chips. Fresh, cheap chips, no less, because remember this was 20 years ago now. Speaking of cost, this episode was one of the most ambitious in Doctor Who's history. Russell T Davies even jokes that they never attempted something on this scale again due to how expensive it was to produce. As of 2011, after the airing of the Wedding of River song, End of the World still held the record for the most visual effects shots in a single episode. It also featured more aliens than ever before seen. Cassandra's practical and CGI effects alone they took months of work and cost a fortune, according to Russell. And the Mox of Balhoun too. He went from being fully animated to a rubber suit worn by actor Jimmy V, who many eagle-eyed fans will recognise as Banakafalata and the Grask from the Sarah Jane Adventures. And he said it took about 3 hours just to get the suit on. That's just incredible. Additionally, Jabe's facial features were softened from the originally planned design for her character. She was originally planned to have like a heavy bark look to more resemble a silver birch, setting her apart from the other tree beings on Platform 1. However, again, due to cost, she adopted a more uniform appearance for the final take when production started. Moving on to the plot itself, there is so much about this episode that I loved. First and foremost, there was a scene where the Doctor modified Rose's phone so that she could call Jackie back in her own native time. Not only was this a very bittersweet moment where a seemingly normal conversation for Jackie meant the absolute world to Rose, but it introduced something more realistic to the Doctor's companions, something which set them apart from the classic companions: homesickness. Now, companions had offhandedly mentioned being homesick in the classic era, with Barbara, Ian, Victoria, Nyssa, and Adric being some of the most obvious examples of companions who, for one reason or another, felt very cut off from their homes and not having the ability to contact loved ones while travelling in the TARDIS. However, likely because the show was written through the lens of the biases of the later half of the 20th century, no one thought to include some kind of communication system to allow companions to contact home. Probably because even when mobile phones were invented, they weren't really commonplace when Classic Who was on the air. So most companions we saw getting into the TARDIS seemed not to really think much about calling home, and at least while they were on screen, they didn't appear to let it bother them too much. But when bringing Doctor Who into the modern era, when it became much easier for people to call home while they were away, this scene shows a really human side to Rose, who, let's not forget, has only been away from home for a few hours by her perspective, and is now literally being confronted with the very existential concept of her home planet dying its natural death. Next off, you have the alien guests. Now, I often find that putting many aliens in the same room together, especially in Doctor Who, means that writers have to almost do backflips to ensure that they reveal just enough about each of the aliens' origins and motives, while not shifting the focus too far from the Doctor or the main villain. This can often, I think, lead to many seemingly important details being missed about certain characters who look really interesting to the audience, but ultimately play a very little role in the story, and that does bother me a bit when that happens. To an extent, this does occur in The End of the World. However, because all the guests are on Platform 1 to watch the Earth Death event, and they're all described as being the rich and powerful, even though it's a pretty vague lumping of the guests, it's still a perfectly plausible explanation as to why they're all there and what they're about. They're rich, they want to see a good show, and at least some of them intend to pay homage to Earth. That's all we really need to know about everyone, and any extra depth that could be added to essential characters, namely Jabe, Cassandra, Rose, and the Doctor, could be added, so there was just enough space for the main focus of the episode and these additional characters. Then, of course, there's the setting, a platform in orbit of the soon-to-be-destroyed Earth on the very day the sun expands. Now, I know this isn't scientifically accurate, though the reason for this is given in an in-universe explanation, which is kind of okay, if not a little bit rushed. It's still an incredibly interesting setting. It kind of reminds me, honestly, of Murder on the Orient Express, except the twist here is that the very setting of the episode is what is ultimately being weaponised by Cassandra. The fact that they're willingly standing on a space station that's about to be blasted by solar radiation. I personally prefer this compared to Cassandra's original plan to stage a hostage situation, because I can just imagine how underutilised the setting would have been had the episode pivoted from this storyline. And lest we not forget the last purebred human, Lady Cassandra O'Brien, Dot Delta 17. Now, Cassandra actually gets a lot more depth in the prose The Lives of the Rich and Thin, where we find out that a lot of her outlandish claims about her parentage and her own life are complete fabrications. Cassandra, in my opinion, is the perfect blend of comedic satire while being a bona fide narcissist. On one hand, she does represent a very over-satirised perception of society's beauty standards, as her pursuit of beauty led to anything human being chucked in the bin, as Rose puts it in the episode. But on the other hand, Cassandra seems to have been driven by a kind of insanity that only really comes with privilege. She is a rich woman who's stepped on and completely ruined the lives of countless people to get what she wanted, and even before becoming a sentient trampoline, she craves the one thing that wealth cannot buy: validation. She doesn't see herself as a victim of societal pressures. If anything, she embraces them because they're what have motivated her to pull off such an immoral heist. But even at the end of the episode, when her plan is foiled, her only response is that she'll fight any charges brought against her with the technicalities of the people she killed were aliens, which would have kept their lawyers busy for centuries, as she put it. Narcissistic, insane, and yet still iconic. This Doctor Who villain's sinister voice muttering, "Moisturise me," is etched into my brain even 20 years later. Absolute masterpiece. There's only really a few things that I can say bothered me a little bit about the plot of this episode, and those were due to the same production constraints that made Cassandra's scenes difficult to film. Many of Zoe Wanamaker's lines had to be cut because they were just too difficult to incorporate into the story. And because of this, the episode overran, and because of this, we had a pacing issue. After all, this episode was ultimately a murder story and an investigation. But because of the pacing issue, the first murder victim's death, the steward, didn't have as much heft to it as the plot point would have suggested, because the episode jumped from his murder to a full-blown subterfuge story with the Doctor racing against the clock to save everyone. Don't get me wrong, there was foreshadowing at the start of the episode where Rose asks if they were going to swoop in at the last minute and save everyone, which is ultimately what the Doctor does. And don't get me wrong, that scene where the shields are raised just in time still has me at the edge of my seat whenever I watch it. But the episode was a little bit choppy because things went from 1 to 11 very quickly, which is something that critics at the time raised after the episode aired. Additionally, and this is a much smaller point, but the space station was massive. Was there seriously not any safe bays away from the window that the guests couldn't take shelter in? Like, they're the rich and famous and powerful. You'd think there'd be a few more safety measures at an event like this, lest Platform One's companies be sued. It made no sense to me that there was no sort of bunker chamber or, I don't know, lifeboats or something. Just something that the guests could have used to shelter in or be evacuated quickly. It probably would have had a lot less heft to the story if there were. But at the same time, it didn't make much sense to me that while they were standing around, none of them thought to maybe stand somewhere away from the window. Yeah, that just bothered me a tiny bit. Still bothers me now, 20 years later. In conclusion, this episode is hands down my favourite Nine and Rose story. It has set the bar very high in terms of what a second episode of any Doctor Who series should look like. It touched on the themes of existentialism, grief, loss, and as well as it gave us a comedic and unflinching view of the impact societal pressures and privilege have on the minds of powerful people, and the dangerous consequences that having such a mindset can have. In universe, it added significant depth to both the Doctor and the Ninth Doctor's characters, on one side showing us that the Doctor is both the same energetic, fun-loving alien we all knew from the classic series, while also evolving his character into someone who was very willing to resort to violence when sufficiently provoked. On the other side of this, we have Rose, who showed the audience a much more relatable companion archetype than what we were used to in the classic series. She grapples with being confronted with the end of everything she ever knew, homesickness, and just the overall strangeness of the adventure, but ultimately she still decides to stay with the Doctor, despite experiencing firsthand the danger and the bizarreness and the feelings of isolation that can come with it all. This episode, ironically for being set in the far future, really brought Doctor Who into the modern era, and I think that it still holds up incredibly well 20 years later. What did you think of this episode? Let us know in the comments of your favourite streaming app or in the comments section for our social media posts for this episode on Instagram and TikTok at Tardessian Files Podcasts. We also have a Blue Sky account now under the handle at tardessianfiles.bsky.social, where we will not only be posting about new episodes, but we'll also be using it to engage with our lovely viewers to hear more of your ideas and feedback. Please leave a like and subscribe, and as always, see you next time on Tardessian Files.